Welcome to Mr. Horror. Ever wondered what truly happens behind the walls of a hospital? Tonight, we bring you 3 real horror stories that will make your blood run cold. Are you ready for a chilling experience that will keep you captivated? Let's begin. Stephanie had always been a healthy person, so when she started experiencing severe headaches and dizziness, she knew that something was wrong. She went to see her doctor, who referred her to a specialist. The specialist ran a battery of tests, but they all came back inconclusive. Stephanie felt frustrated and scared, not knowing what was happening to her. One day, the headaches became so intense that Stephanie could barely see straight. She knew that she had to go to the hospital, and she went to the emergency room. The ER was packed with people, and Stephanie had to wait for hours before being seen by a doctor. When the doctor finally arrived, he seemed harried and distracted. He ordered a CT scan and a series of blood tests, but Stephanie could tell that something was off. She felt like the doctor wasn't really listening to her, that he was just going through the motions. After the tests were done, Stephanie was admitted to the hospital. She was given a room on the 5th floor, and she settled in for what she thought would be a few days of rest and recovery. The room was small and cramped, with outdated furniture and peeling wallpaper. Stephanie didn't mind, though. She was just glad to be somewhere where she could rest. But as the night wore on, Stephanie started to feel uneasy. She could hear strange noises coming from the hallway, and she felt like she was being watched. She tried to brush it off as her imagination, but the feeling persisted. And then she heard a knock at her door. Stephanie's heart raced as she called out, asking who it was, but there was no response. The knocking grew louder and more persistent until Stephanie was convinced that someone was trying to break in. She tried to call for help, but her phone was dead. She was completely alone and vulnerable. Suddenly, the door burst open, and a group of shadowy figures entered the room. Stephanie tried to scream, but someone covered her mouth with a cloth. The last thing she remembered was the sickly sweet smell of chloroform and the sensation of being dragged away from her hospital bed. Stephanie woke up in a dark and damp room, feeling groggy and disoriented. She could hear the sound of dripping water and the faint hum of machinery. She tried to sit up, but her hands and feet were bound with rough ropes. Panic set in as Stephanie realized that she had been kidnapped. She didn't know who her captors were or what they wanted, but she knew that she was in danger. Hours passed, and Stephanie was left alone in the room. She was hungry and thirsty, and her head was pounding from the chloroform. She tried to remember everything that had happened, to piece together any clues that might help her escape. As the hours turned into days, Stephanie's condition deteriorated. She was given meager amounts of food and water, and she was subjected to a series of bizarre experiments and tortures. She was injected with strange drugs, exposed to blinding lights and deafening noises, and forced to endure unbearable pain. But even as her body weakened, Stephanie refused to give up. She knew that she had to fight for her survival, to use every ounce of her strength and willpower to stay alive. And then, one day, she saw an opportunity. One of her captors had left the door to her room unlocked, and Stephanie knew that it was her chance to escape. She managed to wriggle free from her ropes, her hands raw and bleeding. She crept through the dark and twisted corridors, her heart pounding in her chest. And then, finally, she saw a glimmer of light in the distance. Stephanie ran towards the light, her heart racing with hope and fear. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew that it was her only chance for escape. As she drew closer, she realized that the light was coming from a stairwell. She hesitated for a moment, wondering if it was a trap. But she knew that she had no other options, so she started to climb the stairs. The stairs seemed to go on forever, and Stephanie was exhausted by the time she reached the top, but she didn't stop. She pushed open the door at the top of the stairs and burst out into the sunlight. She was outside, in a vast and desolate landscape. She didn't recognize where she was, but she knew that she was far away from the hospital and her captors. Stephanie collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath. She felt like she had been reborn, like she had escaped from the clutches of death itself. But her relief was short-lived. She soon realized that she was still in danger. She was alone in an unknown location, with no food, water, or shelter. Stephanie knew that she had to keep moving to find help or civilization. She started to walk, her body aching with every step. She walked for hours, through scorching heat and biting cold. She stumbled through rough terrain, her feet blistered and sore. But she didn't give up. She kept pushing forward, driven by the need to survive and the hope of escape. And then, finally, she saw something in the distance. It was a small town, with clusters of buildings and streets that stretched out before her. Stephanie stumbled towards the town, her heart pounding with anticipation. She didn't know if she would find help or danger, but she knew that she had to take the chance. As she drew closer to the town, Stephanie realized that something was wrong. The streets were empty and the buildings were deserted. There was no sign of life or civilization. Stephanie felt a sense of dread wash over her. She wondered if she had stumbled into a ghost town or if something even more sinister was at play. But she knew that she couldn't turn back. She had come too far, fought too hard to give up now. She pushed on, her heart heavy with fear and uncertainty. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew that she had to face it head on. Stephanie walked through the deserted streets of the town, her heart pounding with fear and anticipation. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew that she had to face it. As she turned a corner, she saw something that made her blood run cold. It was a figure standing in the middle of the street. It was tall and dark, with glowing red eyes and a sinister grin. Stephanie tried to run, but she couldn't move. She was paralyzed with fear, her mind consumed by terror. The figure moved closer, its shadowy form looming over her. Stephanie could feel its breath on her face, could smell its sickly sweet scent. And then, suddenly, it was gone. Stephanie was alone in the empty street, trembling with fear and confusion. She stumbled through the town, her mind reeling with the strange and terrifying events that had taken place. She didn't know what was real and what was imagined, what was a hallucination and what was a nightmare. But she knew that she had to keep moving, to keep fighting for her survival. She stumbled upon an abandoned house and she went inside. Inside the house, Stephanie found a room with a phone. She picked up the receiver and dialed 911. Within minutes, the police arrived. They found Stephanie, weak and dehydrated, but alive. She was taken to the hospital where she received treatment for her injuries and trauma. She told the police everything that had happened about the hospital, the kidnapping, and the strange town. The police investigated, but they found no evidence of the hospital or the town. It was as if they had never existed. Stephanie tried to put the events behind her to move on with her life, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching her, waiting for its chance to strike. Years passed, and Stephanie tried to forget. She got married, had children, and built a life for herself. But the nightmares still came, the memories still haunted her. She knew that she would never be free from the horror that had consumed her life. And then, one day, she received a package in the mail. It was a small box wrapped in brown paper. She opened the box and she saw something that made her heart stop. It was a note written in the same sickly sweet scent that she remembered from her kidnapping. The note read, "I'm still watching you. You can't escape me." Stephanie screamed, and she knew that the horror had never truly ended. It was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its chance to strike again. Larissa was a nurse at a busy hospital in the heart of the city. She had been working there for years, and she thought that she had seen it all. But one night, everything changed. It was a quiet night, with only a few patients in the hospital. Larissa was doing her rounds, checking on the patients and making sure that they were comfortable. As she walked down the hallway, she heard a strange noise. It was a soft moaning coming from one of the rooms. Larissa approached the room, her heart pounding with anticipation. She opened the door and saw a patient lying in bed, writhing in pain. Larissa rushed over to the patient, trying to calm her down, but the patient was delirious and she kept moaning and thrashing around. Larissa called for the doctor, but he was busy with another patient. She tried to keep the patient calm, but she could feel her own anxiety rising. And then, suddenly, the patient stopped moving. Her eyes rolled back in her head, and she went completely still. Larissa tried to revive her, but it was too late. The patient had died. Larissa felt a chill run down her spine. She had seen death before, but never like this. Something about the patient's death seemed off, unnatural. She tried to shake it off and continue with her rounds, but the feeling of unease lingered, following her down the dark and deserted hallways. As the night wore on, Larissa started to hear more strange noises. She heard footsteps in the empty corridors, whispers in the darkness. She tried to ignore it, to focus on her work, but the feeling of being watched, of being haunted, only grew stronger. And then she saw something that made her blood run cold. It was a figure standing at the end of the hallway. It was tall and dark, with glowing red eyes and a sinister grin. Larissa tried to scream, but she couldn't. She was paralyzed with fear, her mind consumed by terror. And then, suddenly, the figure was gone. Larissa was alone in the empty hallway, trembling with fear and confusion. She tried to compose herself, to tell herself that it was just her imagination, but she knew that it was real, that something was very wrong in the hospital. Larissa couldn't shake the feeling that something was off in the hospital. She tried to tell herself that it was just her imagination, that there was a logical explanation for everything. But the strange noises and eerie feelings continued. Patients were dying, seemingly for no reason. The doctors were baffled, and the nurses were scared. Larissa tried to investigate, to find out what was really happening in the hospital. She asked around, talked to other nurses and doctors, but no one had any answers. One night, as she was doing her rounds, she heard a strange noise coming from the supply closet. It was a scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. Larissa cautiously approached the closet, her heart pounding with fear. She opened the door and saw something that made her scream. There was a patient lying on the floor, covered in blood. She had been attacked, brutally beaten. Larissa tried to revive the patient, but it was too late. She had died from her injuries. Larissa was horrified. She knew that someone or something was lurking in the hospital, preying on the patients. She tried to tell the other nurses and doctors, but no one would listen. They thought that she was just imagining things, that she was overreacting. But Larissa knew that something had to be done. She couldn't let the patients continue to die. She started to investigate on her own, digging through medical records and security footage, and what she found was shocking. There was a doctor, a well-respected and admired member of the hospital staff, who had a dark secret. He was the one responsible for the patients' deaths. He had been experimenting on them, using them as guinea pigs for his twisted medical experiments. He had been injecting them with a deadly poison, then watching as they slowly died. Larissa was horrified. She couldn't believe that someone could be so cruel, so inhumane. She knew that she had to stop him, to bring him to justice. She went to the police and told them everything that she had discovered. The doctor was arrested, and the hospital was shut down. Larissa had saved countless lives, but she couldn't shake the feeling of horror and dread that had consumed her. She left the hospital and tried to move on with her life, but she knew that she would never forget the horrors that she had witnessed. Larissa thought that she had put the horrors of the hospital behind her. She moved to a new city, started a new job, and tried to forget. But the nightmares continued. She would wake up in the middle of the night, covered in sweat, with the memories of the hospital flooding back. She started to see things, strange and terrifying visions that she couldn't explain. She saw the doctor, his sinister grin and glowing red eyes haunting her every waking moment. She knew that she had to do something, to face her fears and confront the horror that had consumed her life. She started to research, to find out more about the doctor and his twisted experiments. She discovered that he had been working with a secret organization, one that was dedicated to using medical science for their own twisted ends. Larissa realized that she couldn't do this alone. She needed help, someone who knew what she was going through, someone who could help her fight. She found a group of survivors, people who had been through similar experiences. They shared their stories, their fears, and their hopes. Together, they formed a plan. They would take down the doctor and his organization, no matter what it took. Larissa led the charge, using her knowledge and experience to guide the group. They infiltrated the organization, gathered evidence, and exposed their twisted experiments to the world. The doctor was arrested, along with his accomplices. The organization was disbanded, and the survivors finally had closure. Larissa felt a sense of relief, but also a sense of sadness. She knew that she would never be the same, that the horrors of the hospital had changed her forever. But she also knew that she wasn't alone. She had found a community, a group of survivors who understood her pain and fear. And as she looked to the future, she knew that she had a purpose. She would continue to fight for justice, to expose the darkness that lurked in the shadows. The horrors of the hospital had not defeated her. They had made her stronger, more determined, and more resilient. And as she closed her eyes, she felt a sense of peace. She knew that she had done the right thing, that she had faced her fears and come out on top. The horror had not won. Larissa had. James had always been fascinated by medicine. He had dreamed of becoming a doctor since he was a child, and he had worked hard to make that dream a reality. He was thrilled when he landed his first job at a prestigious hospital in the city. He thought that he had finally made it, that he was on his way to a bright and successful future. But things started to go wrong on his first day. He was assigned to the night shift, and he quickly realized that something was off in the hospital. Patients were dying, seemingly for no reason. The doctors and nurses were overworked and stressed, and there was a sense of tension and unease in the air. James tried to focus on his work, to do the best that he could for his patients, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong in the hospital. One night, as he was doing his rounds, he heard a strange noise coming from one of the rooms. It was a soft moaning, coming from a patient who was supposedly asleep. James cautiously approached the patient, trying to calm her down, but the patient was delirious, and she kept moaning and thrashing around. As he tried to calm her down, James noticed something strange. There was a strange smell in the air, sickly sweet and overpowering. He tried to ignore it, to focus on the patient, but the smell grew stronger, filling the room and making his eyes water. And then, suddenly, the patient stopped moving. Her eyes rolled back in her head, and she went completely still. James tried to revive her, but it was too late. She had died from unknown causes. James was horrified. He had never seen anything like this before, and he didn't know what to do. But he knew that he couldn't ignore it. He had to find out what was happening in the hospital to uncover the truth. He started to investigate, talking to other nurses and doctors, and digging through medical records. And what he found was shocking. There was a secret society of doctors who were using their patients as guinea pigs for their twisted medical experiments. They were injecting them with a deadly poison, then watching as they slowly died. James was sickened by what he had discovered. He knew that he had to stop them to bring them to justice. He went to the police and told them everything that he had discovered. The doctors were arrested and the hospital was shut down. James had saved countless lives, but he knew that he would never forget the horrors that he had witnessed in the hospital. James had exposed the doctors and their twisted experiments, but he knew that it wasn't over yet. There were still unanswered questions, still things that he didn't understand. He started to research, to find out more about the secret society and their motives, and what he found was even more disturbing than he had imagined. The doctors weren't just experimenting on their patients, they were also part of a larger organization, one that was dedicated to using medical science for their own twisted ends. They were creating deadly viruses, engineering diseases, and conducting illegal human experiments, and they were using their wealth and influence to cover up their crimes. James was horrified. He couldn't believe that people could be so evil, so willing to sacrifice innocent lives for their own gain. But he also knew that he couldn't let them get away with it. He started to gather evidence, talking to people who had been affected by the organization's actions. He found a group of survivors, people who had been through similar experiences, and together they formed a plan. They would expose the organization, no matter what it took. They would risk their lives to bring the truth to light. James led the charge, using his medical expertise and his determination to guide the group. They infiltrated the organization, gathering evidence and uncovering secrets. They faced countless obstacles, from security guards to hired assassins, but they refused to give up, even when the odds seemed impossible. And then, finally, they had the evidence that they needed. They had uncovered the organization's biggest secret, a virus that they had been planning to release on the world. They went to the authorities, presenting their evidence and demanding justice, and this time, the authorities listened. The organization was exposed, and the doctors were arrested. They were charged with countless crimes, from murder to conspiracy to commit acts of terrorism. James and the survivors had saved countless lives, and they had exposed the dark underbelly of the medical world. But as James looked back on everything that had happened, he couldn't shake the feeling of horror and dread that had consumed him. He had seen things that he could never forget, and he knew that he would never be the same. But he also knew that he had done the right thing, that he had fought for justice and exposed the darkness that lurked in the shadows. And as he closed his eyes, he felt a sense of peace. He knew that he had made a difference, that he had saved lives and made the world a better place. The horror of the hospital had not defeated him. It had made him stronger, more determined, and more resilient. James had fought against the darkness that had consumed the medical world, but he knew that he could never forget the horrors that he had witnessed. He left the hospital and tried to move on with his life, but he found it difficult to adjust. The memories of the hospital haunted him, and he struggled with depression and anxiety. But he refused to let the horror defeat him. He sought out therapy and support, and slowly but surely, he started to heal. As he worked through his trauma, he began to think about what he could do to prevent others from going through what he had experienced. He became an advocate for medical ethics and patient rights, using his experience and knowledge to help others. He spoke out against the dangers of medical experimentation, and he fought for transparency and accountability in medical research. He traveled the world, speaking at conferences and meeting with medical professionals, determined to make a difference. And he found a sense of purpose, a reason to keep fighting. He knew that he had made a difference, that he had saved countless lives and brought the truth to light. As he looked to the future, he knew that he had a mission. He would continue to fight against the darkness, to stand up for what was right, and to make the world a better place. The horrors of the hospital had not defeated him. They had made him stronger, more determined, and more committed to his cause. And as he closed his eyes, he felt a sense of peace. He knew that he had done the right thing, that he had faced his fears and come out on top. The horror had not won. James had triumphed, and he knew that he would continue to fight for justice and the truth, no matter what. Thank you for watching this scary stories of hospital horror. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more scary true stories. And remember, always be vigilant and never be afraid to speak out against the darkness. Together, we can make a difference and fight for what is right. Until next time, stay safe and keep your eyes open. Good night.